record. Yes.
Hello, and welcome to this TESOL Career Path Development interview series called Global Voices. The network, more commonly known by its acronym CPD-PLN, is one of the professional learning networks of TESOL International. We are committed to addressing professional development throughout members' careers and promoting intentional efforts to build members' career paths. Focusing on professional excellence, the CPD-PLN looks to provide new resources for teachers in search of direction throughout their career. And this interview series is one such resource. To promote the international aspect of our PLN and of TESOL International, we've invited one prominent member of our profession from each continent to share with us their own career path. Their experiences, their insights, and their advice will surely offer you food for thought in your own journey. Today, our guest is from Australasia, or Oceania. I think in a minute she might explain the difference. It is Professor Averil Coxhead. She is a professor in applied linguistics in the School of Linguistics and Applied Language Studies at the Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. Te Haringa Waka. I don't know how much pronunciation is there. I don't know too much of her background, as she will be doing that shortly, but most of you may know her as the academic word list creator, which has become an integral part of tertiary study around the world. So welcome, Averil. Thank you so much for today. Really, really appreciate it. And I'm really looking forward to hearing a little bit about your story. So I'd like to start with talking perhaps about the current context, your current place of work, what you're doing, and maybe a little bit about New Zealand, because we hope that we're going to have viewers from all over the world. And therefore, I'm sure they know something about it through Lord of the Rings and things like this. But could elaborate a bit more about that, and also the TESOL environment in New Zealand.
Okay, so thanks very much, Kia ora. Mick, thanks very much for this invitation and this chance to talk with you tonight, my time, morning, your time. So here in New Zealand, it's we're a fairly small nation, really. We're getting towards 6 million people. We're quite a mixed group of people, which is fabulous. So we have native speakers of English, people who've come from England, Scotland, Ireland, that sort of background coming into the country. We have the local population, Indigenous Māori population, and we've got a massive movement of revitalization of the language of Te Reo Māori. So one of the real main areas of growth in language teaching and in language learning in New Zealand at the moment is actually learning Te Reo Māori. And interestingly, during our COVID lockdown, which was in March last year when we closed the borders, they're still closed at the moment while I'm talking to you, but we locked everybody down for a couple of weeks. The number of language learners grew in Te Reo Māori, and we're still seeing growth in that area now. So it's really an interesting area. So I work at Victoria University of Wellington, Te Haringa Waka. Te Haringa Waka means that's the place where you can arrive with your canoe and you can connect your canoe to this place to keep it safe. So it's like a place where you are safe and you can hitch your canoe and connect your canoe to us. So where I work is in Wellington, which is the capital city of New Zealand. And one of the interesting things I think about New Zealand is that one of the legends of the country is that it's shaped. The North Island is shaped like a fish with an island. And I think there's an upside down thing that happens there. And then the second main island is a canoe. And then underneath it, there's another smallish island, and that's the fish hook. So New Zealand rose from the sea. It was fished from the sea as part of a Māori legend. So Wellington sits at the bottom of the North Island, and we don't have that many direct flights, but it's the center of, we only really connect to Australia through Wellington because the airline, the airstrip is quite short. So Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson is based there. Quite a few, there's quite a major arts scene, for example. And in Wellington, we have two universities, Victoria University of Wellington and Massey University. We have Otago as well. They have a medical school. So my role, I'm within the School of Linguistics and Applied Language Studies. We have, COVID has had a major impact on many things. So we things have changed a little bit for us, but we have an applied linguistics program. So we do applied linguistics and TESOL. Applied linguistics, of course, is a research element to do with teaching and learning of languages. So we have an undergraduate degree in TESOL and applied linguistics. Oh, sorry, undergraduate degree in TESOL, and then we do postgraduate masters, taught masters and masters by thesis as well. And we have students who are working by distance and face to face in Wellington. So I also supervise postgraduate research. I have MA students by thesis and I have PhD students at the moment. Some of them are overseas because they were overseas at the time when they were gathering data, for example. So I have one in Vietnam, two in Vietnam, one in China, and one's just coming in from Sri Lanka at the moment. So it's an interesting situation from that perspective. I also do quite a bit of research, mostly in vocabulary, and really my interest in vocabulary was piqued by studying at Victoria University of Wellington for my MA and getting to know Professor Paul Nation, who is a major leader in our field of vocabulary research.
Thank you. Yes, indeed he is. Yes. So let's go back to the beginning. We all had a life before TESOL, and eventually we made a decision to enter into this field. But could you just give us a little bit of a background of your life before TESOL, growing up?
Sure.
And when and that point where you suddenly decided, right, I want to go into this field.
Sure. So I grew up in on a farm in a place called Taranaki, which is an area on the west coast of the North Island, and there's a very big, large mountain there. So I grew up under a mountain, but close to the sea. It's a very special place, especially in my heart.
Sounds amazing.
So yeah, and when I was a child going through to primary school, we had one of my favorite classes was learning Te Reo Māori, and that was with a teacher called Mrs. Utiku, and she used to use songs and encourage us to count and to give simple greetings and have fun with the language. And that was my first experience of speaking and working and learning in another language, and it was a very enjoyable, memorable, and important time for me, because that was a time when I had experience of learning with an adult who was a fluent speaker of a language and somebody who was really dedicated to not just telling us about the language, but getting us to use it and getting us to think about it and to understand. If we were singing a song, it was important to know what the lyrics were and things like that. So that was a very early language learning experience for me. Then at school, later on at high school, I studied French, and I also went on an exchange. So I went to Tahiti in French Polynesia, amazing, for 6 weeks. And that was another experience of not only learning a language, but using it and trying to understand what people were saying. And so I've always been quite interested in what happens with language and how it gets used in different contexts. I then traveled through Asia. I'm a New Zealander, so we like to get out and about and to travel. So we have something called OE, which is our overseas experience. So we quite often go traveling. And part of what I did when I went traveling in Asia was that in my undergraduate degree, I had met quite a few teachers who had come from Asia and the Pacific to study at Victoria University of Wellington in the English Language Institute. So I'd already had contact with these people in my university hall. I was a deputy warden, so I met them every day. And I became really interested in what they were doing. So they were coming to New Zealand for professional development to then go back and teach English again in their home countries. And to me, that was the first time that I had contact with language teachers who were not in New Zealand schools or in New Zealand universities, but they were coming in from places like Papua New Guinea, for example, from Indonesia, speaking their languages and being part of a community and joining in the New Zealand education system. So I found that really interesting. So my first bit of travel was going and visiting some of those folks in Indonesia and in Thailand, and again spending time trying to pick up language and trying to learn it and get involved in that space. So I then went and worked in the UK, which many New Zealanders do. And then I was washing dishes, and somebody was saying, well, you seem to be really interested in language. Maybe you should get involved in a language school over the summer in UK universities. And I thought, really, that's a job? Okay, I'll do that. Beats washing dishes. So that was my first experience, and highly inexperienced in terms of the structure of language or how English really works or anything like that. But I understood about the need to communicate, that language learners needed to learn a language in order to be able to speak and read and write. That was really important to me. And I then went and did a CELTA, and I did that in Bournemouth. And then I got a job with International House in Hungary. And then I got in touch, and that was fabulous. I really got to know a lot. That was 1991. And then I contacted International House and said, I really like Hungary. Can I go to Finland? They said, Romania is nice in spring. I said, yeah, good. I'd really like to go to Finland. They said Romania is nice in spring. So I went and lived in Romania for a year, which was great because that was my opportunity to learn, to take my Hungarian skills that I developed in Hungary and then taking them into the new
You learn
context.
Hungarian.
Yeah.
Kudos.
And
Kudos to you.
that was that was my moment of understanding a little bit more about politics and language learning, that you can speak a language in another country and actually there might be people who don't welcome the fact that you can speak that language. So that was a big eye opener for me, and I think that that was a really important lesson to think about, the politics of language, who gets to use a language and when. And it also through a major question for me, which has become a research question really, which is that Romanian has that Italian connection, Latin connection. So language learning for Romanians, when you have a structure of a language which is so much closer to English as a target language, is so different from teaching and learning in Hungarian, where the language is fundamentally quite different from English. So I think that was part of my learning journey, was coming through places in Asia where the language was very different from English, and then going into Romania and thinking, I can pick up Romanian quite easily because actually this makes sense to me because it's so close to English and French, which I've learned. So it's a bit of a long explanation, but that's what I did. And then I decided I wanted to come home. So after Estonia,
No, it's fascinating, and I think a lot of people, they don't necessarily start out with this idea of a career in TESOL, but they fall into it and they like it, and so that's quite. I have to be honest, it's something I recognise in my own career. So you just go home after your exploits abroad, and so could you perhaps talk us through what happened since you came back?
Sure.
Various steps that you've made in your career since then.
Sure. So I came home with 3 goals. So one of the things that I wanted to do was postgraduate education, because I realized that I knew some things about teaching because I'd done a lot of teaching. I knew some stuff about language learning. But when I was in Estonia, I think in 1993, I went to a conference that was organized by the local university there. And Larry Salenka, I've looked this up today, Larry Salenka from the University of Michigan gave a keynote speech. It was my first conference ever. And so too did, I think it was Gillian Brown on pronunciation from the University of Edinburgh. And I remember sitting in the audience, and these people were talking about research and talking about elements of language and language teaching. And I remember Larry Salenka answering a question from the audience and saying, yes, that's a very good point, but it hasn't been empirically proven. And I thought, oh, okay, all right. So there's a lot we don't know, right? And so I decided that I wanted to come home. I wanted to live in New Zealand. I wanted to play cricket on Saturdays. And I wanted to do a postgraduate qualification to get a job in a university setting, because I really wanted to be teaching in English for academic purposes. I sort of figured out that there was something there which was inherently interesting to me. And I also just wanted to live back in Wellington again and be close to my friends and family. So that was important to me. I then did a postgraduate diploma in teaching English to speakers of other languages. So that's a TESOL. And during that time, I was in a language testing course with Professor John Reid from the University of Auckland, who was at Victoria University at the time. And he was talking about word lists, and he was saying, there's the university word list, but it really needs to be reworked, because that word list was a very good first attempt, but we need something else which is a bit more solid for teachers to be working with and talk that through. And I was sitting there thinking, I could make a word list. I'm sure that I could do that. That sounds like a really useful thing. And I was thinking about my own teaching at the time and thinking, I don't really know with my students, what do I need them to focus on? How much do they know? What words do they meet all of the time when they're studying? So it became really clear to me that there was something concrete that I could do which would bring in my language knowledge, language skills, but I would be learning a great deal at the same time and hopefully developing something that was useful. So that became, I then went and talked to Professor Paul Nation, said, "You don't know me. Hi, I'd like to redevelop the university word list." He looked at me and said, "Well, you need to read these things." I was like, "Okay, good." And then I began an MA with Paul then. So that became the second part of my postgrad studies. So what happened for me in that time when I was back in New Zealand and back at Victoria University of Wellington, I was doing two things. One was I was teaching in the English proficiency program. So that was solid EAP, English for academic purposes. And I could see that there was a real life purpose with working with these students because they wanted to get into university, study postgraduate level, study undergraduate level. And there was a real research need so the work that I was doing as a researcher was complementing what I was doing as a teacher. But I also think that what I was working on as a teacher helped my research as well, because it helped me sort of figure out some of those questions. So after the MA, I got a job as a lecturer at Palmerston North at Massey University, and I had 5 very happy years there, and that was fantastic. And while I was doing that, I did my PhD with Paul Nation, who was back at Victoria. Then I went back to Victoria, so chopping around a little bit, but I went back to Victoria University of Wellington in 2009. So just this year, I was made Professor of Applied Linguistics and TESOL. So that it's been a,
Congratulations.
thank you, but it's not a normal journey. I don't think it's a normal journey to professor in a way, but I think that if I hadn't done the years of teaching in different places and having the joy and the time of that, my main role was to talk with other teachers and to read things and to think about things and to concentrate on my students and what they were telling me that they needed to be able to look at resources and think about what I was doing as a language teacher. I think that my path in my later career wouldn't have been as clearly driven, because I think I still have pedagogical issues that I think about, and then I try and work on my research in that space. So I get to do all kinds of fabulous stuff at the moment. I have a very happy time looking, for example, at the vocabulary of traditional Chinese medicine. One of my PhD students, Chai-Ling Lu, has finished her PhD in that area. For example, we've just been publishing on what are some other examples? We've been doing some work on looking at the vocabulary of textbooks and thinking around what happens with that. Do learners have enough vocabulary to deal with that? We've been looking at vocabulary testing. I've just published a book with Paul Nation on measuring vocabulary size with native speakers. So there's a lot of different elements to my job, which I really, really enjoy. And it's really challenging, I have to say. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds incredibly varied and
yeah,
absolutely.
Really great. Very enjoyable. Yeah. So
I do want to ask you.
Really.
I do want to ask you about the academic word list.
Sure.
Really is, when you were doing the study, when you were doing your research into this, did you envisage the impact it would have? Think, right, I'm onto something here, and this is going all over the world, and people are hopefully going to sort of really be thankful for it, and it will have a real impact. Did you have that?
I didn't realize the impact that it would have, to be completely honest. And I think that there are a couple of reasons why it gained so much traction. So one is that my good friend and colleague, Irina Algort, I went to her one day and said, can we put the academic word list up on the internet? Because we've got it. I've published it. It's available as a booklet, but let's do that. Let's put it up there so that teachers and people can access it. It's much easier to get information out there. So she designed a website, thank you. And so I think that it was easy to find for a start, which is ironic because now I get people saying, can you send me a link to the academic word list? And I think, really? Okay, sure, I can do that. Also, textbook developers contacted me fairly early on and said, this is something, we'd like to. It's like, yep, great. So I think in terms of availability, I think it was that was one reason why people got to know it quite early on. Also, there was an early article in TESOL Quarterly, and that gained quite a lot of attention. And I think that what I was thinking at the time is, I think as a teacher, I can use this. And when I was working with my students in the English proficiency program, it was something so tangible for them to work on. That was like, oh, okay, so this is frequency. So you could talk to them about ideas like frequency, which is really important in vocabulary studies, that we should be working with the vocabulary that occurs often, because that's the language people need the most, right? So this is some of the work that Paul Nation has so eloquently talked about throughout his career and still does today, to say, this is the stuff we need to be doing. One of my favorite things about the academic word list is one of my former students who had been in my English proficiency program class, where we'd use the academic word list. We'd talked about frequency. We'd very much focused on making sure that these students who were going forward into their university studies, but they knew what this was and how it worked, and they'd done some work on learning the vocabulary and working with it, using good principles. Anyway, this guy, and his English name was Jerry, and he came to see me one day, and he'd just finished his first year of university studies, just finished his first year of his undergraduate degree. And he came and he stood at the door, and I was like, Jerry, great to see you. Come on in. And he said, you know the academic word list? I said, yeah, I really do. He said, I see those words all the time. I thought I should just come and tell you. I was like, thanks, Jerry. and that's it, right? That's what I was really trying to do. So that there are more recent studies on academic vocabulary. There's the academic vocabulary list by Mark Davies and Dee Gardner, may he rest in peace. They have a really wonderful website, huge corporate. It's lovely to see their work. The work in itself, the academic word list, is one thing, right? But now we're seeing work that's come from that. So you see much more vocabulary research looking at academic purposes vocabulary. You've got the academic spoken word list now from Yen Dang at the University of Leeds, who was one of my PhD students. It's wonderful to see the generations of work coming after that work, which is that's also something that I didn't see was going to happen. I think Paul Nation was quite happy that I worked on the academic word list, because it meant that he no longer got emails about the university word list. And actually I can see why that would be quite attractive for him. And we were talking about this just last week, actually talking about academic vocabulary again, just as so what now? What do we need to be thinking about now? So it's good.
I was noticing that one of your newer projects is looking at trades vocabulary. Yeah. So going into the trades, so maybe for other kinds of qualifications which are not the bachelor's or master's level, but the difficult vocabulary that people need to be able to master. And I think as you kind of alluded to in something that I read, you mentioned that a lot of people might be studying in English as a second language, and they have to deal with all this difficult vocabulary. To talk a little bit about that.
Oh, I'd love to. So this project was language and trades education. So we called it the Latte Project, which is I think it's a really important piece of work. And I'm not saying that because I was involved in it, but I think that this is one of the times when applied linguists have stepped outside our normal areas of doing research and looked at something, not just because it's interesting, but because it's really, really important. So my colleague, Associate Professor Jean Parkinson, is a discourse analyst. So she was working on move analysis and all kinds of interesting things to do with the discourse of the trades language. I was looking at vocabulary. Dr. James Mackay, who is he's a scientist, he's a physics educator, and he works in the engineering area of in this local polytechnic where we did the research, and he's looking at images in text and looking how text works with images, which I think is really important, because if you have an image like a graph or a picture of an engine or something in a text, you need to be able to interpret the image as much as you need to interpret the text which goes with the image. So I find that work really interesting. We also had Emma McLaughlin working with us, and Emma is a language specialist working within the Polytechnic area. So you had, and me with my interest in technical vocabulary. So some of the things that I think are really important about that research are, first of all, just the sheer volume of technical vocabulary in a trade is one thing. And it's fascinating that high frequency vocabulary can be used with specialized purposes and specialized meanings. So if we look at carpentry, for example, the word line in carpentry often doesn't mean draw a line. It's actually about lining a wall. Right? So we have this understanding of a word, but then you put it into that context, which is quite technical, and the meaning changes. So one of the things that we're looking at the moment, as a kind of follow-up from what the Latte project is, looking at high frequency words that are technical, and we're starting to develop tests and tasks in order to try and find out how much people know of these high frequency words. They're often the same between languages, which is really helpful. And we've also made some technical word lists in plumbing, carpentry, automotive technology, and fabrication, which is to do with welding and engineering, making things. And what we did with that project was we went to the tutors in the local polytechnic and said, what do you give your students to read? Can we have copies? What do you give your students to write? Can we have copies? And we got permission, ethics permission, from people who supplied these texts. We also put mics on the teachers, blessed teachers,
Interesting.
and we asked them to record themselves teaching. It's the noisiest corpus you've ever heard in your life, because they make houses, and so you get a lot of banging and crashing and yelling and shouting and all of that sort of stuff. We also collect the text that the carpentry students write. They have builders' diaries where they put pictures of the work that they're doing, and they put descriptions of what they do, and that's all part of the evidence of their knowledge. And Jean in particular has done some wonderful work looking at what happens to over the course of a year, how people move and change in terms of their professionalism, and it shows in the pictures that they take. So often the first pictures are, and you can imagine, right? So this is your first day of your course. What are you taking pictures of? Your mates all going, showing your tools, doing your stuff. And by the end of the year, Jean's research has shown very clearly that the level of professionalism, the focus of the pictures changes enormously. So another thing that we did with the Latte project is I worked with a Tongan researcher. Tonga is a country in the Pacific. We have a lot of tradespeople come from Tonga, highly skilled tradespeople, and they come into the country and into New Zealand. And one of the challenges that they have is the technical vocabulary in English. So what we did, Kiko and I worked on translation work, basically. So taking these word lists in English, translating them, and you can imagine the job, right? So you got 4 trades. These lists are huge, about 1,000 words. And what Kiko used is called talanoa as a research technique. So talanoa is a Pacific methodology where you work really closely with people. You gain trust. You spend time together. You eat dinner. You go to church, and at the point where the trust is very clear and the friendship is very strong, then you can start doing the work that you're doing to do the research. So as a researcher from a European background, I realized a lot about myself in that process, because we would have meetings and I'd say, Kiko, g'day, how you doing? He'd say, yeah, I'm really good. It's like, okay, good. How's your work going? And he'd say, oh, we all went for dinner last night. It's like, good. And, and for him, that was the most important thing, because he was building relationships with people, and he was saying you can't do this research without the trust. And after about the 7th or 8th week, I suddenly thought, so he comes in, I say, how are you? He says, I'm good. And then I want to get straight into business. I'm not building a relationship with this person, and I have to in order to make sure that this research goes ahead. And the main thing about talanoa is if there's no trust and no relationship, the research is not valid. So in the research that I've done in the past and do now, I think about validity in a very different way. Whereas in this talanoa research methodology, trust and the relationship is all about the validity. So we got there. That was amazing. They did this translation work. He went to Tonga. He talked to people in the trades there. He had trades experts, Tongan speakers who took this work on, and they did all of this work. It's amazing to see. And so I think that part of the Latte project is that I learned more about technical vocabulary, absolutely. Technical multi-word units, absolutely. I've learned that university level texts are about the same level of difficulty as trades-based texts in terms of vocabulary. You need a vocabulary size of 8,000 to 9,000 words to read a trades-based text, but you're still going to find words that you don't know. The more you know about the trade, the more successful you're going to be with your reading of these texts. And that the speaking, so when we recorded these teachers, around in written trades texts, probably 1 word in 3 or 4 is technical. In spoken trades text, 1 word in 10 is technical.
Mm-hmm.
How do people learn in the trades? Through speaking and listening and interacting. So there's a gulf, I think. There's a major difference between this highly interactive learning Te Reo Māori with Mrs. Utiku when I was a kid. People go into the trades because they love it, or because, cars, they want to be there, they want to do this, they have a large camaraderie, there's big mateship that happens within these groups. And I think that the spoken word, when you think about their text, the texts are enormously difficult to read, they're highly technical, and these people are not dumb. These people know what they're doing, that they've learned through a spoken mode, and then the written words are often quite difficult to look at. And you look at the spelling of some of these things like Scotia and you think, really? And I interviewed some of the students as well, and they were saying it's big on the memory, so you have to follow what the tutor's saying, you have to keep these things in your head, there's no time to really stop and think about things. And I also found it really interesting, we wrote a book about the project, but I found it really interesting looking at the purpose of the tutor talk and what the tutors got the students to do, and talking through problems. One of my favorite examples was the tutor was saying, okay, so we turn the engine on, something, 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 this is all going, that's great. So if I go to the shop and I get a pie and I come back and I eat my pie, what do you think would happen? And then eventually somebody says, oh, the engine would burn out. And so he's problem solving with the students, but he's doing it, he's using humor, he's using everyday examples of language. It's not high level academic things, but it's really important that people get these processes and they understand what's going on. And there was a lot of instances where the tutor got the students to come to the front of the room and explain something or work through a problem together, and it was very clear that the students had to get control of this language, had to get control of what the principles of science or physics were behind what they were doing, and they had to actually produce that language themselves. It was really important to the tutors because that's how the learners showed they understood something.
Your passion
You want to
is
ask me about something interesting? Latte project, every time. Fabulous.
No, your passion is very, very clear on this project. And in the context of this interview, talking about career path, I think it's really interesting to see that even at this stage, when you've achieved a lot in your career, you're still looking for new projects, you're still learning, you learned about a new research method, you're creating these new lists and out new knowledge. So that's really, really, really amazing. And
so Professor Graham Kennedy, may he rest in peace, at his farewell, when he was professor at our university in my school, he said you have to do something new every 7 years. So with him, he published one of the first, probably the first dictionary of New Zealand Sign Language. He published a dictionary of New Zealand English. He was a corpus linguist, excellent scholar, and he was an example of somebody without fear changing and still maintaining excellence. I have a lot of really great mentors and people who are examples of taking a step in a new direction and being prepared to be a learner again. And I think that's really, really important.
And that's a really good tip, I think. If I may, I'm going to call that the 7-year itch. Okay.
Go for it. Graham may well have made the same joke.
So we did talk a little earlier about COVID, and you talked a little bit about that. It's a strange time that we're all living in, but we're all dealing with it. What I would like to do perhaps now is to move on to final thoughts from your side.
Sure.
You've explained about the learning from the teacher in the school, your school, then going to your project in Tahiti, then going to visit friends that you made in the region, and then going abroad and finally falling into TESOL, and then coming home and really following your passion. I just want to end really by asking you to share with us perhaps any tips. And I think you just mentioned one about, keep learning, keep trying something new. Is there anything that you did which you regret, that you think you would have done it differently before? And is there any other global sort of feedback or advice you would give to people in their own TESOL career paths?
So do I have regrets? No, I don't think I can. I could never say that I wish I hadn't lived in Romania, or I wish I hadn't gone to Estonia, or I wish. One of the things that I think is really important in terms of professional development is going to conferences and also presenting if you can, because I think that that means that you're really starting to put your heart into something, and you're engaging in the conversations around it. One of the things that I do think I should have done earlier on was actually there's a whole world of TESOL and applied linguistics that I didn't really know about. So I was reading textbooks, and I was looking at trying to figure out trying to figure out English grammar and doing those things. But actually, there's a whole world of pedagogically, so teacher-based, really good things to read. Lots of newsletters. Joining a local organization, I think, is really important. So we have TESOL, which is the Wellington Association of Teachers of English and Speakers of Other Languages. I think joining those sorts of organizations, your professional network, all of those things mean that you might end up having a conversation with somebody where somebody says, you might want to go to that session and listen to that person, or you might want to meet this person because they're interested in the same stuff that you are. I think that those times when you can talk professionally with other people who are engaged in TESOL and in different elements and aspects of TESOL, I think that's really important. So going to a local organization, going to conferences that people put on, if you can, joining them virtually. COVID has moved a lot of barriers out of the way for people to be able to do things like what you and I are doing now. You're in Doha, I'm at home here, So,
yeah.
and I think that that's kind of breaking down some barriers. There was a fabulous conference in Hong Kong in January, and you looked at where people were coming in from. So, Vietnam, Indonesia, Bahamas, Uruguay, just all over the place. And you think, well, actually, maybe 5 years ago, nobody would have had those kinds of opportunities or even thought that they could have attended those events. So the challenge is when we come back to a world where we can move around and we can do these things, that we then actually don't forget that, yes, we can meet through Zoom. That's fantastic. But if we have the opportunity to meet face to face, I think that those are really golden, precious times that we should be looking forward to as best we possibly can. We've just opened our borders to Australia, so we now have a bubble between Australia and New Zealand. We're not able to go to conferences yet, but I'm really looking forward to the time when we can actually do this sort of professional work and be face to face again, if we possibly can. And if we can't, that's okay, but just join and talk and get those sort of instances where you're talking about your practice and then talking about ideas and maybe reading a little bit if you possibly can as well. Come and do the MA with us. Come and do a PhD, change your direction, think about things in a different way.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time you've given for us today. And to the people who will be watching, we hope you enjoyed this Global Voices interview and you can take something away to reflect on regarding your own TESOL career path. And we hope that you will take the opportunity to enjoy the rest of the series available on our YouTube channel. So please do leave a comment if you wish, and do take the chance to hear the stories of others from around the world who have made an indelible impact on our profession. Thank you once again, Averil, so much. Thank you everybody for tuning in, and we wish you all the best in your own career path.
Okay, now before you hit stop, I want to say to all the teachers out there, kia kaha, kia manawa nui, be kind, be patient. Thank you very much. Thanks so much, Mick, for organising all of this. It takes a lot to give to a profession and to learn in a profession, but then to try and take things forward and try and offer professional development, I think that's really important. So thank you very much for giving me the chance to talk about me.
You're most welcome.
Really enjoyed it.
Absolutely our pleasure. Thank you so much, Averil.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.